Welcome back to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. It's your host, Kyla Chanel here, and today we have Dr. Austin Hogwood. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Virginia's Robert M. Berne Cardiovascular Research Center, and that's where he focuses on cardiovascular exercise physio. He earned his Ph.D. in exercise physio from the University of Virginia, and Dr. Hogwood's Ph.D. research explored the effects of inorganic nitrate supplementation, both alone and in combination with exercise, on exercise performance and vascular health. He has investigated how these factors influence exercise across sex, across the menstrual cycle, and alongside exercise training. He's also studied how vascular function may be altered by inorganic nitrate supplementation with exercise in postmenopausal women. When not in the lab, Austin enjoys lifting weights and playing soccer and spending time with his wife and his dog. This is a great episode where we review one of his fantastic studies, so enjoy and hopefully you gain something. Welcome back, everybody. We have for you guys Dr. Austin Hogwood. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
We are excited to learn about all things, cardiovascular health, nitrate supplementation, potential differences in sex or menstrual cycle phase. Very fascinated to talk to you today. But before we dive into all that fun information, we're going to do our two truths and our lie. I'll let you break those down for me.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure which direction to take this, but here it goes. So the first one would be I'm the first person in my family to attend college. The second one is that I played college soccer.
Okay.
And the last one is that I spoke at my college graduation.
Okay.
So I thought about going science with it, but I figured get more about me personally, I guess.
That's sometimes it's nice for me as the host. We've had some scientists on and they it was basically like a pop quiz test for me. And I was
Yeah.
panicking.
The pressure's on.
Yeah. Thankfully I got them
remember
right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I feel like you definitely played soccer because, well, maybe it wasn't college soccer. When we were researching your background, I could have sworn you played soccer. First person to attend college. That's very rad if that is true. Spoke at your college grad. I could see you doing that as well. I'm gonna go with that you didn't speak at your college graduation. But don't tell me the answer. We will
You'll
reveal
never
it.
know.
Yeah, we will reveal. And then if you did speak, we want to hear your speech. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so why don't you give us a little bit more background? Our listeners heard kind of a shorter bio about you, but what sparked your interest to dive into the cardiovascular and exercise physio world?
Yeah, so uh I guess it all started when I was just a wee lad. No, my dad he always pushed sports a lot, and he also always pushed going to school.
Mm.
And so for me, I went to college and I started out, I kind of bounced around in majors. I was an engineering major, then I switched to PE teaching. Then they dissolved the PE program, and so I had to switch from that. And so I ended up in kinesiology because I liked, sport. And I ended up really just kind of falling in love with the science a little bit when I learned what exercise physiology is. Because
Mm-hmm.
before that, you learn like amoebas or, random stuff that's like so abstract. You're like, who,
Yeah.
who cares, But it wasn't until I got into like, okay, this is practical to me. This makes sense to me. And I don't know if it was because my dad's a mechanic, car mechanic now. And, I think sometimes like how the body works and how things operate that maybe that makes sense to me as a physiologist, but so I got really engaged in that and I found that to be interesting. And I was taking an exercise physiology lab course as an undergrad. And I guess I was like really excited in the class and gung ho. And so the teacher of the lab course was a PhD student. He said, hey, come do an internship in our lab with us or volunteer in our lab. And so that's kind of how I got involved in science in the first place. And then the lab that I really stuck with was a cardiovascular ex-phys lab or a vascular lab with Ryan Garton. who was a Ph.D. He had just finished his postdoc at in Utah, and he was starting up a lab. And he was like, "Hey, I'll take you in." And we were doing all these research studies and using ultrasound to look at how much the arteries are dilating and how much blood flow is going through them, looking at kind of blood flow regulation, and kind of we were using different models like to kind of temporarily hurt the vascular function and then
Mm.
trying to see if we could add different things to recover it. And so
Mm.
we might have someone like sit for 3 hours, watch their artery function plummet because it does when you sit for a long time. And then we
Oh.
might give them like an antioxidant, for example, to see is this related to free radicals, or we might have them exercise beforehand, or, and so that's kind of really where that research was. It was kind of applied, but also exercise and nutritional supplementation kind of stuff. But that got me into cardiovascular phys. It wasn't really something that I was like, man, I just need to know about the heart and the vasculature. But, sometimes things just kind of come with serendipity and you end up where you end up.
Mm.
But being in that area, I started being interested in nitric oxide because that's like the holy grail of vascular vasodilators. And so when the time came that I decided I wanted to pursue my PhD, I was looking for different labs and there's some pragmatism to it. Like I wanted to stay kind of close to my family in Virginia because all that was at Virginia Commonwealth University in
Mm.
Richmond. But I didn't want to limit myself too much. And, there's a PhD stipend that pays for stuff. There's tuition reimbursement, so some of it's just like, hey, like at the end of the day, I'm going to go where it's best for me. But it kind of
Yeah.
worked out well in that about an hour down the street at the University of Virginia, there's a researcher, Jason Allen, down there. And he does all this research in inorganic nitrate supplementation
Mm.
with beetroot juice. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and then another reason that I really wanted to work with him was that he was doing a lot of research in clinical populations. And so I hadn't really gotten the opportunity to work with any like, sick people in my undergrad or my master's, but that was something that I kind of always wanted to work towards. So I
Mm-hmm.
kind of viewed working with Jason at UVA as like, okay, I can really explore how is nitric oxide supplementation with nitrate going to help exercise or vascular health, and then I can bridge that into some clinical experience as well. So I
Mm-hmm.
came to UVA, and that's kind of how I got involved in all that research.
That's awesome. I have to jump back a little bit to your mention of this study with sitting and vascular health. And it
Yeah.
makes me, I'm so curious. So do you like, does this transfer to like benefit of a standing desk or like, did you ever hear the sitting is the new smoking?
Yeah, I've given those lectures quite a few times, but
Cool.
yeah, it's really bad for you.
Mm.
The irony is you're always giving these long lectures to people and they're sitting the whole time and you're like, this is sitting terrible for you. And you're like, you never say like get up and do some jumping jacks or something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we did a few studies in that area. But what we would do is we'd use an ultrasound and we'd look at the femoral artery, and we'd do this technique called passive leg movement. So basically
Mm.
we move someone's leg for them, and then this
Mm.
will actually trigger a blood flow response. And the blood
Mm.
flow response is basically like the heart rate's not really changing, nothing's really changing, but you start getting an increase in blood flow. And it's supposed to
Mm.
be more of a metric of kind of like microvascular function in
Mm.
the very
Mhm.
small blood vessels. And
Mhm.
so we were doing that, and there was a couple other techniques being used in the lab, like flow mediated dilation, which is another um, vascular measure. And so we were basically doing these as our kind of outcome measures, and we'd say, hey, come into the lab, sign the consent form. We're going to have you sit one day
Mhm.
for 3 hours. We're going to do this vascular test before you sit and after you sit. And one day we might have them do like high intensity interval training. One day we might have them take a placebo or
Mm.
a vitamin C tablet or something like this. And so in all the placebo groups, the sitting always wrecks the vasculature. And
Mm.
we see it really in as little as like 30 minutes to an hour. But we were
Really?
doing 3 hours of sitting initially, and we kind of realized like, well, we can shorten this and they'll see the same effects. So,
Yeah.
but that was actually where I started really getting into menstrual cycle differences and how
Mm.
estrogen is affecting things because we started looking at some of that work there at VCU.
Mm.
But generally speaking, exercising before sitting is very protective.
Mm.
Vitamin C supplementation before sitting was very protective. But if you're a fit person that didn't exercise and then you go sit, like if you just didn't exercise that morning, but you're like a regular exerciser, that alone does not protect you. You still get the vascular dysfunction. So, um, yeah, it was interesting studies over there, and I think I'll definitely go back to studying some of that in the future. But
Yeah.
right now, I'm in a different area. So,
Yeah, yeah. So when you say wrecked the vasculature, what does that mean? Like what marker
right.
is just like not as much
So
vasodilation or
correct. Yeah, yeah. Like the blood vessels are not responding to the same extent. So the
mm,
microvascular or the macrovascular, the bigger vessels, are not able to either vasodilate or accommodate this extra blood flow.
mm,
And it's kind of the idea of it's kind of like, all right, if we, these are acute uh, assessments, right? But
mm,
the idea is that if you do this repeatedly and you're putting your vascular function in a kind of, I don't know, deficit, or you're damaging it or you're hurting it or impairing
mm,
it repeatedly, then it's going to accumulate into all these big problems, right? So a
mm,
common theme that you'll see, especially in exercise research, is they'll do an acute exercise bout and they'll see what does it do acutely. And the idea is kind of that, okay, well, if you do this repeatedly, then you're going to see adaptation, right? And
mm,
so this is kind of like the opposite of it now. Um, it's not always as black and white as that, right? Like I
mm,
know if you take vitamin C every day, for example, in high doses, it's not exactly good for you and it can block
mm,
exercise adaptations and stuff like that. And so, um, practically translating some of that research, you need to be hesitant with,
yeah.
but whenever I'm getting on a long flight, I'll try and grab an orange juice. I don't know if
Nice.
it's
Yeah.
enough to do anything, but
Yeah.
that's another study that probably needs to be done because we did pretty high
Hmm.
doses of this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was some of
Okay.
the earliest stuff I ever did in the lab. I was like 20 years old working with Ryan Garten doing that stuff. And
Wow.
I didn't know what I was doing, but I
Yeah.
was in people's groin with an ultrasound. So it
Yeah.
was it was like, welcome to science.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm definitely appreciate you breaking that down and explaining that because I've certainly heard, of course, like the sitting is the new smoking and cardiovascularly, I didn't really think about I didn't think about that component as silly as that sounds. I just thought it was like we're not moving as much.
Hmm.
And so but that, yeah, that really helps actually explain it and help my brain understand it better. What do you recall the vitamin C dose you were using in the study?
I think we used a gram.
Oh, okay.
And I think we were giving I think we gave it with vitamin E as well and alpha lipoic acid, which
Mm-hmm.
it was like a cocktail that we'd give. We gave it for a few of our studies in the earlier work, but I encourage anybody that's interested in it to look up those papers. They're all published on PubMed and stuff. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Well, we will
yeah.
link those for the listeners in the show notes too, that those studies. Because yeah, that I think that is fascinating. Um, do you sit and stand like at your work?
No, I sit all day. I'm like
Oh
the
no.
worst. Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do, But
Yeah.
I don't have a standing desk set up. I'm sure I could buy
Right.
one of those little over desk ones.
Yeah.
I'm also like ADD and I'm a fidgeter and I'm
Yeah.
always like, I can't barely sit for more than 30 minutes anyway. But if I'm lucky, I'll get into that like flow state and I'll be listening to like brown noise and then I'll sit for like an hour and I'll get a lot of work done. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like I'm very productive with my work, but I'm sure my blood vessels are like, come on, man, like, better than
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
it's hard to be a good
Right.
patient or a good subject when,
Yeah.
you got life in the way.
I totally get it. I think about that all the time with my job. Like I'm helping athletes like fuel and crush these like amazing events and like 100 milers and 200 milers and it's like I'm doing it behind a computer.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like
Right.
man, I wish I could be. But I do have a standing desk and I do have a walking like pad that I actually just recently got that
Yeah.
can go under my desk. So I try and alternate as best as I can. But yeah,
I think those are good strategies because even there's been some studies that have shown even if you just fidget your legs, it'll help a
hmm.
lot. So,
Okay.
yeah, any
That's
movement
good.
is good. Or like get up every 10 minutes and walk a little,
Yeah.
anything you can do.
Yeah. Okay, now that makes me one other question. What are your thoughts on those compression boots?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that they're a lot of BS.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of them are like massage boots
Hmm.
basically, which,
Yeah.
if you like that, great. But I've heard people say, oh, they're increasing your like lymphatic drainage and all this
Mm.
stuff, and that's going to get rid of the toxins. And I'm like, I
Yeah. Kind of
I
wild
don't know.
claims.
That sounds
Yeah.
like you're talking about a lot of science that no one's ever actually tested. So
Yeah.
it might help if you're sitting for a long time because you are kind of muscle pumping things around, but
Hmm.
I don't know
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. No one's taking those on a overnight flight to Australia or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd love to dive into the study that we initially reached out to you about. So, this, I know you said this is a couple years old, not necessarily your primary focus right now
Mhm.
from like a vascular lens, but the study for our listeners was called The Effects of Inorganic Nitrate Supplementation on Exercise Economy and Endurance Capacity Across the Menstrual Cycle. And I believe it came out in 2023. Um, I'd love to have you break some of that down for us, kind of maybe what drove you to do that study. I think you gave us a little bit of a background of your journey and exercise, well, nitrates and all that stuff, but what
Yeah.
drove you to look further into menstrual cycle? And also thank you as a male for looking into menstrual cycle
Yeah.
differences.
Yeah, no problem. I always feel kind of like I'm mansplaining this stuff. So, you know what I mean? I'm like, oh, well, the early follicular and late follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. And I'm like, I didn't know what any of this stuff was a few years back. And,
Yeah,
I obviously don't experience it, but no,
yeah.
I mean, this stuff needs to get studied. And there was decades where women were just viewed as little men, which
Hmm.
is ridiculous to think of in hindsight. But
Hmm.
um, so, my original research with VCU, we did one or two studies where we started to look at the effects of the menstrual cycle. Specifically, we were looking at estrogen and estradiol across the follicular phases of the menstrual cycle. So, the early follicular phase being basically during menses,
Hmm.
kind of like days like 1 to 4, 1 to 5 after menses onset begins. And that's generally when estrogen is lowest in that early follicular phase. Then about, which granted is still higher than males, right?
Hmm.
But then about days 11 to 14, so about halfway through the month, there's this sharp spike in estrogen, and then it'll come back down. So there's kind of this few couple of days here where estrogen gets really, really high relative to the early follicular phase. Now, the later side of the menstrual cycle, like days 15 to 28 or so, is the luteal phase, and I've admittedly never studied that, so I want to go ahead and give that caveat up front. The reason that we haven't is because one, these studies are really hard to do, and I can explain like pragmatically why they're difficult, but um, estrogen is thought to be fairly low, not super low there, but like kind of more middle.
Hmm.
But progesterone is also elevated, and progesterone and estrogen have kind of competing effects on nitric oxide. So for us, we wanted to really explore how does estrogen, which has shown to be cardioprotective, and that's part of the reason that we think that women die of heart attack or cardiovascular disease less than men, especially in those premenopausal years, is because of the protective effects of estrogen
Hmm.
and estrogen increasing nitric oxide specifically. And so we wanted to see, all right, if we have low estrogen in the early follicular phase and then we have that estrogen peak in the late follicular phase, how does that affect nitric oxide? How does that affect vascular function? How is it protective? How is it not? And so when I was at UVA, I started my PhD in 2019, and then a worldwide pandemic started.
Hmm.
And so my plan was to do like clinical research and do peripheral arterial disease, heart failure, very different stuff than I ended up doing, which is totally fine. And
Wow.
sometimes that's how the cards fall. But I always had the interest in the menstrual cycle research and estrogen just because I did one or two studies with it in my master's.
Mhm.
But so when COVID hit, they basically told us, hey, if you're not like solving COVID or you're not doing clinical research, like heavy clinical research as like a medical doctor, you're not doing human research
Mm,
in sick people.
mm,
Because you're just going to increase exposure, you're going to increase the chance that you're going to get them sick and they might die, and this is something that we should avoid. So
mm,
for about a year and a half, that was kind of in place, and we couldn't recruit any patients in a clinical study. So we kind of had to think pragmatically, like, all right, let's switch gears a little bit. What's been shown in the nitrate literature, and because this is the area that my boss is an expert in, and we had already bought like 2 years of nitrate supplementation in bulk, and we were like, we got to use this stuff before it expires.
yeah.
Let's find some ideas. And so I'd love to, I don't, you know I'm not like some superhero man that studied the menstrual cycle because I was
Mm,
doing it for all the right reasons. Obviously, I believe in studying women and female physiology, but admittedly, it was very much like secondary to COVID.
mm,
But basically, we wanted to see. because the data in males kind of has shown a couple different things. One being that if you give someone nitrate supplementation, which nitrate is NO3, which can then reduce to nitrite, which is NO2, and that can reduce to nitric oxide, NO. It'll directly increase nitric oxide bioavailability, and we know that that's just like proven physiology, or I guess chemistry, which is not my expertise really. But the data in males basically had shown that if you give people like a beetroot juice supplement, so they just like grind down a bunch of beetroot, which has a lot of nitrate in it, and you give it to males, you increase their exercise performance. And this has kind of been shown in a few different ways. So one of the ways they'll do is like a time to exhaustion. So they might put you at, I don't know, 90% of your max and say, go as long as you can. And one day they're going to give you the nitrate, and one day they'll give you placebo. And we always used, for all of our studies at least, we used a beetroot juice that is depleted of the nitrate. So whenever we were doing our studies, we had beetroot juice and then we had placebo beetroot juice. So they still have like the same phytochemicals and vitamin C and stuff like this, but the nitrate is missing from the one. It's like a filtration process that the company provided it for us.
That's great.
But so what we really saw was that in males, the time to exhaustion was increasing, and also the submaximal oxygen consumption was decreasing. So if you put somebody at like 50 watts and then you had them do the same thing after nitrate supplementation, they were breathing less oxygen. So they were able to do that same amount of exercise with like basically more efficiently, because they're not needing as much oxygen to meet that metabolic demand. And there's really not been many supplements at all that have shown anything like that. So I always thought that was very interesting. But then there was a couple studies that started to look at muscle function at the time. Granted, I started my PhD, I guess 6 years ago now. So there's a lot more research out now, which is great. But basically they were starting to see a signal in the muscle too, and say, maybe it's like the fast twitch fibers, for example, that are really deriving most of this benefit. But the data in women was just horribly lacking. Like there was one study by Kate Wickham that basically showed nothing. There was like no benefits. It was a pretty comprehensive study, but what they did was they studied women all on oral contraceptives. And so, it's when you're getting into the kind of the weeds of the physiology research, there's very commonly, if you're going to recruit women into a study, almost all the studies will say, okay, we brought in the women during the early follicular phase when it's menses and estrogen is low. That way you can kind of control for hormones as much as you can and say, all else equal, we've at least attempted to control for this. And, but if you're, that's obviously ignoring like 25 days of the month.
Right.
And so to me, that's kind of insane that we'll just say, oh, this one study in like 10 people showed this one effect in this 2-day period, and that's it. That's the conclusion. It's like, it's just not how it is. And so it completely ignores the high effects of estrogen. And we kind of looked at it as like, if we don't see anything with low estrogen and the highest estrogen that we can capture, then there's probably not an effect of estrogen, right? Or at least in our hands, in our studies. And so that was really kind of what sparked us to start looking into these things. I did it with Jason Allen, my PhD mentor. I had a co-mentor, Art Weltman, who been studying hormones and endocrinology and exercise for like 30, 40 years.
Wow.
And they were my two mentors on the project. And I did this study alongside another PhD student, Joaquin Ortiz de Zevallos, who's now doing a postdoc in Karolinska. And we kind of just said, all right, let's dive into this. Is there an effect of estrogen? Is there a sex difference here? And we published a series of studies. I know you brought up the one study in the Journal of Applied Physiology. We've actually published 2 other studies, or 3 other studies in the same journal in the following year. So all this data is up there if people want to see it. But we basically did one study where we looked at the exercise time to exhaustion. We looked at the exercise economy, and we looked at vascular function. And we did that in males versus females. So we wanted to see, in our hands, do the males actually see this benefit that everyone else is claiming? And how does that compare to the females, specifically during that low estrogen phase of the menstrual cycle? And then I published the second study, which is the one that you referred to, where we took the same women and we brought them in for the early and the late follicular phase. And we basically said, okay, when do you think you're going to start your menstrual cycle? And, that's anybody's guess sometime, right? But
Yeah.
because these were all women that were not taking contraceptives at all. So, sometimes it gets a little unpredictable. And so we'd say,
Hmm.
all right, if you think you're going to start on like the 10th, for example, what we want you to do is start taking this beetroot juice 2 days before you think you're going to start your menstrual cycle.
Mm.
Because kind of in the literature and what the most consistent findings was basically a couple of days of dosing and then an acute dose that morning, 2 hours
Mm.
before you actually start whatever the event is. And that's
Hmm.
just because it takes about 2 hours to metabolize the nitrate and get it into the system. And so we said, okay, we're going to bring you in for one menstrual cycle, basically the early follicular low estrogen phase on nitrate. We're going to bring you in for another one on placebo. You're not going to
Mm.
know which one it is, and we're not going to know. We were blinded to it. We only know from the blood markers that we take afterward. And then we had them come back and do the same two things on the late follicular phase. So it's four
Mm.
visits, two on nitrate, two on placebo, and then low estrogen and high estrogen, basically. And we wanted to see, how does the time to exhaustion change, if at all? How does the submaximal exercise capacity change, if at all? We also looked at arterial stiffness to see how the
Mm.
vascular function might be differing. And we did this in like, I can't remember the exact age, but it was like roughly 25-year-old women. These were basically
Hmm.
like, undergrad and grad students that were,
Hmm.
I would say like recreationally active. Some of them
Hmm.
exercised a few days a week, but these were not like super freak athletes or anything.
Yeah.
Um, and so we brought them in, we had them do 2 days of nitrate. So we bought this supplement. It's available on like Amazon and stuff, not a free plug, but James White Drinks. And the reason we
Okay.
use theirs really is because they have a placebo version that they will
Mm.
provide you also. And
Hmm.
so we're blinded to it and we don't know which one they're getting, but we made sure that we had like a third party person allocated out. And so they would drink one in the morning and then they would drink one at night for 2 days.
Hmm.
And then we'd say, did you start your menstrual cycle today? And they'd be like, no. And we're like, okay, good. We gave you extras. Do it again today. And
Yeah.
so really, we do 2 days, but some days it was three, some days it was
Hmm.
four. Um, but then we'd have them drink a double dose in the morning before coming in. So
Mm.
if they were coming in at like 10 a.m. for this testing, we'd say, wake up at 8 a.m., slam two of these things. And if you want to go back to sleep, go back to sleep. And we'd try to make sure we controlled for everything else we could. No
Hmm.
exercise the day before, no alcohol.
Mm.
We tried to get them to eat low nitrate foods
Mm.
leading up to this. So that way, like if they're taking placebo, they're not just like eating a bunch of salad and still getting a lot of nitrate anyway.
Yeah.
We really tried to control for as much as we could. We measured the estrogen and progesterone in the blood to try and confirm the menstrual cycle.
Hmm.
And we brought them in and we did all the testing. And so I can't even remember what your question was. I've been rambling for a while,
No,
but
this is it's perfect. I want to understand study design and
yeah, yeah,
how that all kind of worked. Do you, well, I mean, do you want to go ahead and like share what you guys found from the
yeah,
study?
yeah. So what we found in that one specifically, because we also did the same measures for muscle function in a different
Mm.
study, also
Hmm.
published in Journal of Applied Physiology. But what we found was very consistent between the aerobic kind of cardiovascular exercise stuff and the muscle exercise
Mm.
stuff. And what we basically found was that the nitrate protocol improved the males. It did
Mm.
everything that we saw in the literature prior. It improved the time to exhaustion. It decreased their submaximal oxygen uptake. It didn't really affect the vascular function, but it did improve the exercise. So we kind of felt that that was like a good positive control. We're like, all right, we're doing what has been shown in the literature. And, it's a win for nitrate, I guess, right? It's
Hmm.
helping people exercise better, right? But
Hmm.
when we compared it to the females or the women in the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, what we saw was that the women were not improving. And
Mm.
so they didn't improve the time to exhaustion. They didn't improve the submaximal oxygen, and they had no changes to their vascular function.
Wow.
And so that to us was already like, okay, there might be a sex difference here.
Hmm.
But let's dig into the menstrual cycle stuff a little bit more. And so when we brought those same women back in for that late follicular phase and we compared it, what we saw was that there was really no difference between the menstrual cycle phase.
Mm.
So even if you were on placebo and you did early follicular versus late follicular, nitrate's not involved in the question. That didn't
Hmm.
affect the menstrual, or that didn't affect your exercise at all. And
Hmm.
that's been pretty consistently shown in the literature, I think, right? Like people that I know there's some people talking, oh, you need to periodize your training differently based on the menstrual cycle and stuff. And I'm like, I don't,
Mm-hmm.
in my hands, that sounds a little crazy, but again, I'm not really a practitioner. I'm more of a researcher. So
Yeah.
if people find that that's successful, good for them. But I don't know if our data supports it. I
Right.
know there's some differences in fuel utilization, fat and carb burning and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but so in our hands, the placebo didn't do anything across the menstrual cycle. When we added nitrate, what we saw was that again there was no difference in nitrate, and it didn't matter if you were in the early follicular phase or the late follicular phase, really. But what we actually saw was it worsened a lot of the metrics.
Oh,
And
shoot.
so the specifically, I know the muscular power paper, which is a little different than the one that you're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
But what we showed was that the maximal power actually got worse on
Wow.
nitrate, um, and the time to exhaustion on the cardiovascular paper did as well. So basically, if we took the early and late follicular and we kind of lumped it together, and it's not exactly what we did, but we did a two-way ANOVA and we saw like a treatment
Mm.
effect. But the if the women came in and they were taking the nitrate supplementation, on average, they were doing about 5 to 10% worse at the
Wow.
exercise bouts. And so to us, this was very interesting because we thought at most there would be no difference, right?
Yeah.
And there's always caveats, right? Like this is like 12 or 14 women, depending on which
Mm-hmm.
study I'm talking about. They're not very fit, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
can't really translate this to like super fit people. And I
Mm-hmm.
always want to kind of take everything with a grain of salt, right? It's if we had 100 people and it was a very homogenous group, then great, you can make some more conclusions. But
Mm-hmm.
what we saw was, I think for the first time, was that nitrate actually seemed like it worsened exercise performance.
Mm.
And so we were really kind of trying to rack our brain around this. And the best thing that we could come up with was that there's kind of this like inverted U, right? And I
Mm.
think this is kind of it's consistent through a lot of physiology where there's a sweet spot for stuff, right? And if you
Mm-hmm.
have too low, it's not going to be good. And if you have too
Mm-hmm.
high, it's not going to be good, whether you're changing the signaling or you're changing whatever. But we kind of had this theory that maybe women already have estrogen, they already have good nitric oxide levels.
Mm.
So maybe they're already in that sweet spot. And so when you're getting the nitrate, maybe you're pushing over down the U-shaped curve where it's bad, right? And
Mm.
on the flip side, maybe when your estrogen's gone, like in menopause, the
Mm.
nitric oxide is flipping the other way. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
this sweet spot that protects you. And this is kind of the best thing we could come up with, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
there's not really a way that we've tested that. But whereas maybe males, they have the lower level already at baseline because they don't have estrogen, and nitrate's pushing them into the Goldilocks zone or whatever. And so that's the best theory we could come up with. You know, we tried to rack our brain around, oh, maybe it's vasodilation in the stomach, and that's stealing blood
Mm-hmm.
from the muscles. Or, you know, we tried to look at near infrared spectroscopy, which is this tool to try and look at oxygen in the muscle.
Mm.
We really didn't see anything there. But, you know, within the same woman in the same menstrual cycle, we're seeing that the nitrate was like worsening the performance. And so
Yeah.
to us, it was kind of like, all right, maybe we should pump the brakes on this stuff because, like, I know, for example, there's college sports teams all over the place that women, you know, college sports are taking beetroot juice. And I'm like, well, I don't know if it's helping you. And God
Yeah.
forbid, it might actually be hurting you, right?
Yeah.
And not to mention, if you're taking it in one single time point, that's one thing, right? But a lot of people, I think, take it like every day and they're
Mm.
trying to confer like an extra training effect. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if I improve 5% today and I improve 5% tomorrow, eventually you would think that would make you adapt better, right? But
Right.
um, I'm just not sure it's the case. You know, our data,
Yeah.
we showed consistently across like 4 or 5 different metrics that whether it was the muscle function with the maximal power of the quads that we measured, the time to exhaustion, or the submaximal oxygen stuff, none of it ever improved in women with nitrate,
Mm-hmm.
and it actually got worse, which was
That's fascinating.
consistent with that study by Kate Wickham that I mentioned earlier. She showed no changes at all
Yeah.
with nitrate, but those women were all on oral contraceptives.
Wow. Very
Yeah.
fascinating. So, okay, you mentioned postmenopausal
Hmm.
women. Was there
Right.
a study done in postmenopausal or
Yes.
perimenopausal?
So that was my final kind of dissertation study was that, but also in the same journal, we published all this in the same journal because they seemed really interested in it, and it's a good journal, and we like them.
Yeah.
But so we then kind of wanted to look and say, all right, if estrogen doesn't seem to be really doing, I don't know, nitrate and estrogen together don't really seem like the winning strategy, right? But we know in postmenopause specifically that you lose estrogen, women lose estrogen in postmenopause, and their cardiovascular disease risk dramatically increases, right? Like the rate of heart attack increases. And they've looked at this in a lot of different ways. It's not just aging, it's very
Mm-hmm.
specific to menopause and the loss of estrogen. And if you give estrogen back, like in the Women's Health Initiative, you increase the risk of some things like stroke, but some
Mm.
of the other risks decrease. And so there's kind of the argument of like, well, it really might be this estrogen that's protecting them. And we
Mm-hmm.
think maybe it's because we're biased and we're interested in nitric oxide, but we think, okay, well, estrogen increases nitric oxide. So it must be through this mechanism, right? We know how good NO is for the vasculature. And we know estrogen increases it. So you lose estrogen, you lose NO. It kind of seems like a no brainer.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we did was we wanted to see a couple different things is that for one, and I guess this is really the most important factor here is that if you take a postmenopausal woman, all the data thus far shows that if they do exercise training,
Mm-hmm.
they don't actually improve their cardiovascular health like a male does, an older
Mm.
male. So if you look at like the amount that the blood vessel can vasodilate, um, this is like a very common strategy to measure cardiovascular health. In women, it goes down with menopause, and with estrogen therapy, it goes back up.
Mm.
And with exercise training, it doesn't actually help you. But with exercise and estrogen, it does help you again. So there's this, and this is
Interesting.
all work by Carrie Moreau, who's done
Mm.
a lot of fantastic work in postmenopausal women and vascular function. But so we wanted to see, okay, if you're, you know, like a 60-year-old woman and you're living the healthiest life you can, you know, you're exercising all the time and you're still at risk and you still can't improve your vascular function, what can we do to make you then be able to, you know, adapt and to improve that? And so what we did was we wanted to measure, we wanted to do two things. One, obviously, as I've alluded to, we wanted to give them nitrate supplementation. And the other thing was we wanted to look at exercise intensity.
Mm.
And this is partially because you know, we know that if you exercise at a higher intensity, you're going to provoke more adaptations, right? Like all the data shows you're going to improve VO2 max more, you're going to get more cardiac adaptations, you're going to get more vascular adaptations. And there was a little bit of work that was being done with high intensity exercise alone, but in postmenopausal women and looking at the vasculature, but no one had ever looked at a combination of exercise intensity and nitrate
Mm.
supplementation. And so with our last study that we did there was we took I think it was 24 postmenopausal females, and we randomized them to either beetroot juice or placebo. So the
Mm-hmm.
last study we did like 12 or 14, and they did a crossover. So everybody
Mm.
was their own control. But this study, what we wanted to do was we wanted to bring people in on 3 different visits. Obviously, you don't have to control for the menstrual cycle because there isn't
Mm-hmm.
one,
Right.
right? So you can bring them in at any time. And I will say, working with postmenopausal women is great because you're like, hey, when are you free? And they're like,
Yeah.
when are you free? You know,
Yeah.
like half of them are retired and they're like, I'll
Right.
come right now. What's up? You know,
That's
so
great.
so what we did was we brought them in for 3 different visits, basically. Well, 4. First thing we did was a VO2 max test to
Mm-hmm.
measure their fitness and their vascular function at rest. So we looked at the artery dilation and the
Mm.
arterial stiffness. Then we said, okay, you're going to come in on 3 different visits. You're either going to supplement with nitrate or you're going to take placebo nitrate, you know, placebo beetroot juice, and you're going to come in for each of these 3 visits. And we did the same protocol, 2 days of nitrate or
Mm.
placebo before, and then the double dose the morning of. And we had them do a high intensity exercise visit, a moderate intensity exercise visit, and a control visit where they just laid in bed and didn't do
Mm.
anything. We measured their vascular function before and every 30 minutes after the exercise or control period. And then we
Mm-hmm.
also measured blood markers as well. And basically, what we saw was that when the postmenopausal women came in and they did moderate intensity exercise, it didn't do anything.
Mm.
Their vascular function didn't change really at all.
Mm-hmm.
When they did high intensity exercise, there was a little bump in the vascular function. So the flow mediated dilation, FMD, it's a percentage of how much the artery can vasodilate in response to a stimulus. It went up by about 1%, which doesn't sound like much, but when the whole artery is only going up like 6%, then it goes to
Mm-hmm.
7%. It's a pretty big difference, right?
Yeah.
So 1%, which is not bad. Like we'll take that. So high intensity alone. Now, I will say that was not statistically significant, though. So
Okay.
take that with a grain of salt. But then when we brought the same women in and we had them take the different cohort of women, right? Because it wasn't the crossover.
Hmm.
And these are just me listing my own limitations section, basically. But we brought in the women that did the nitrate supplementation first. The moderate intensity started to look like the high intensity. So
Mm.
they started to get that 1% improvement. Um, and then which is interesting, right? And then the follow-up was the high intensity exercise. And what we then saw was that they had about a 2% improvement. And that one was
Wow.
the only one that was statistically significant.
Mm.
And so the way that we kind of explain this in our head is that, um, postmenopausal women are resistant to these changes in their vascular function. It's probably because they don't have estrogen,
Hmm.
and they probably don't have nitric oxide, right? And so if we give them a strong stimulus like high intensity exercise, we give them back nitric oxide with nitrate, or we combine those,
Mm.
maybe we're going to get the most benefit in
Yeah.
these studies. And so that was really the result of that study. And I think that's like the most promising area for nitrate research, in women, especially moving forward, is studying postmenopausal women, because
Yeah.
we're not the only ones that have shown that they have some beneficial effects. And so, I think that that's a really cool area moving forward.
That's great. What was the sample size for the postmenopausal study? Do you recall?
I think we did 12 and 12.
Okay.
So, never massive studies, when you're bringing people in
Right.
for 4 visits each. And I think we had each person come in for 4 hours on each of those 4 visits. You're
Yeah.
asking a lot of people's time, and some
Yeah.
people are like, well, how much are you paying? And you're like,
Yeah.
you're not the right person for this study,
Yeah.
because you're not going to be happy with it. But,
Yeah.
you're doing it for the love of the game and trying to
Yeah.
improve science. But yeah.
Right. Yes. And what was the dose for the dose the sorry, the beetroot group?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So for all the studies, what we've done is kind of what the consensus has done. And my old boss, Jason Allen, he was one of the authors on the consensus documents kind of
Mm.
about this. But they've looked at a lot of different doses for nitrate. What we would give was 13 millimoles, which I don't even know what that means, right? Like in hindsight. So I did some math to like try and make this practical for listeners.
Yeah.
Um, but basically, what they would take was about 400 milligrams of nitrate in the morning, 400 milligrams of nitrate at night. And they would do that for 2 days. So if they're coming in on Monday, they would do a morning and night Saturday, a morning and night Sunday. And then 2 hours beforehand, they would drink the double dose. So they would have
Mm.
800 milligrams. And the idea behind this is like you're kind of saturating the system.
Hmm.
Um, and there's been studies that have looked at longer dosing, lower dosing, higher dosing. This seems to be sort of a sweet spot, or at least
Yeah.
within the range of the sweet spot. So that's kind of why we did that. And I actually even like ran some little conversions. So if you were doing 400 milligrams of nitrate in the morning, for example, that's like eating one beet, like a
Oh, okay.
medium beet, or
Yeah.
like 2 or 3 cups of like spinach. So like a pretty big
Mm.
salad.
Yep.
So I know a lot of people are like, they're buying the supplements and they're not cheap.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm a big advocate that if you can get it naturally, get it naturally. If you can,
Hmm.
of course, you don't know how much is in it. There's a lot of like
Right.
seasonal differences in the vegetable nitrate content and stuff like this. It makes
Oh,
it hard to
yeah.
predict. But and we don't even trust like half the supplements out there. They'll say we have X amount of nitrate, and you're like, no, you don't. You're just lying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do know James White drinks, the ones that we buy off Amazon, or
Hmm.
well, we don't buy them off Amazon, but you can buy them on Amazon.
Yeah.
Those ones are legit. We've tested them hundreds of times, and they are a spot on with their dosing. So
That's
I
great.
guess it's a shout out to that. If their sales go up, I don't
Yeah.
own stock in them, which I
Yeah.
probably should.
Yeah.
Um, but you could eat like a big spinach or lettuce salad,
Hmm.
and you would get the same amount of nitrate. Or you
Yeah.
could eat a salad with like a beet in it, and you're going
Hmm.
to get the amount of nitrate that we were giving, basically.
That's great. And
Yeah.
yours was a liquid drink. It wasn't a powdered capsule or dehydrated form
Correct. Yeah,
of.
it comes liquid, and we just
Hmm.
shake it up, drink it.
Yeah.
Some people get some interesting side effects with it, like the urine can turn a little pink.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that happens regardless of if it's placebo or not. So that's
Yeah.
kind of nice, but
Yeah.
sometimes people will come in and we'd forget to mention that. They'd come in
Mm.
and be like, am I peeing blood? And you're
Oh,
like,
no.
I
Yeah.
hope not, but I would
Yeah.
I would think
Yikes.
it's just, yeah, the beetroot dye flowing through the
Yeah.
system or whatever.
Yeah. Yes, I have heard that. Okay, so I want to be mindful of your time. I have one last question about the
Oh, it's
menopausal
okay.
study. Were they also recreationally active?
Right. So they were, yes, I would say recreationally active. I would say like moderately sedentary to recreationally active at most.
Mhm.
There were a couple people that we excluded from the study because they came in and they just like destroyed the VO2 max test, and we were like, all right, you're like a ultra marathon runner and
Yeah.
you didn't really disclose that. And
Yeah.
I'm glad you got your free VO2 max test, but
Mhm.
we're not exactly what we're looking for in the study.
Yeah.
But yeah, we tried to get people that were not super fit because we didn't want
Mhm.
to. We wanted to try and make this practical for like, first of all, who's most likely to
Right.
adapt? It's the people with kind of average
Yeah.
health, right?
Mhm.
But also most people are not super fit, so we
Right.
didn't want to. I've
Yeah.
never really done studies in people that are like Olympic athletes, which I know in the nutrition world, that's a lot of people's interest is like,
Yeah.
how do I make the 1% even better? I'm more like, how
Right.
do I make the 99th percent get to like 80th percent,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
improve their life and their quality of life. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's yeah, I think that's great. Okay, this might be, I apologize if this is a long answer, but so we keep talking about how estrogen is cardiovascularly protective and how it
Mhm.
did you say it improves nitric oxide?
Yeah, so it works by a couple different mechanisms, but basically estrogen can bind to estrogen receptors that's on the endothelium and the inside of the blood vessel, and
Hmm.
it will directly increase the amount of nitric oxide that's produced and released.
Oh,
And so it
interesting.
will work like all the way down to like the transcriptional level and like genetically change it, but it'll also alter like some of the other pathways. Like nitric oxide is created by this enzyme nitric oxide synthase,
Hmm.
and it will play a role in that pathway. So it kind of works by like two or three different mechanisms, which really has like thousands of other little molecules involved. But
Hmm.
yeah, if you give estrogen, it will produce nitric oxide basically. And
Wow.
so that's really the underlying physiology for why we did any of this was
Yeah.
that effect.
That's great. Very fascinating. Okay. So couple just like final follow-up questions here.
Mhm.
Where do you see this research going, or where do you want to see it going? Whether it's
Yeah,
cardiovascular,
so
nitrate, or sex differences.
I'm not sure that, like, I would say someone needs to study the luteal phase.
Yeah.
We didn't do that. Granted, I think from what I showed, which, N of like 12 or 14, it's not conclusive, I don't think. But I think when you combine the work that Kate Wickham did, that basically showed no effect, and the work that we did, which showed no or even harmful effects, I'm not sure you're going to find anything of that much interest in the luteal phase.
Mm,
And we were asking people to come in like a ton of times. It's a really hard
yeah.
study design to do. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure that area really merits a whole lot more research. However, I think in the postmenopausal space, there's a ton of research that can be done.
Hmm.
Still, I think that that's where I would drive most of the research. And another thing that I think really would be fascinating would be that people don't look enough at exercise training. A
Mm,
lot of these studies are like, hey, we brought you in one time and you had nitrate one time and it improved this one time. And it's like, okay, cool. But like, that's not what are you going to do? Just drink nitrate like the morning of a race and
yeah.
hope it doesn't wreck your stomach because you've never really drank it before? Or do you want to
Right.
like take something like a pre workout or something repeatedly to really help
Hmm.
you? Right. And so shameless plug, I published a meta-analysis on this, and there
Hmm.
was only like 10 or 11 studies that
Mm,
looked at exercise training where they randomized people to a nitrate supplementation or a placebo supplementation and had them train, and they looked at their VO2 max and all this.
mm,
And none of them had looked at just women.
hmm.
And it's just it's poorly, the research is kind of poorly done in that area largely. Like a lot of them, they'll say, hey, you're going to train with nitrate for this 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, or placebo. But
Hmm.
then they'll say, okay, but then when you come in for your last VO2 max test to see if you improved and how much you improved, go ahead and drink the nitrate again. And I'm
Mm,
like, but that's not really, now you're talking about like you trained. But now you're talking
Hmm.
about an acute dose, so you don't really know
Right.
if training on nitrate helped you, or if it's just because you had the nitrate the morning of the VO2 max test again, you know?
Right.
So I think there's a ton of work that could be done in that area, especially in postmenopausal women. We're
Hmm.
trying to we have some grants and some research going on doing that, looking at the exercise intensity and nitrate. But those are the main areas, I think: exercise training and the postmenopausal space. There's more and more clinical data coming out all the time too, like peripheral arterial disease,
Mm.
as these are like people that have blockages in their calves and they
Yeah.
can't walk because they just don't get blood
Wow.
flow. And nitrate has been shown to be somewhat helpful in them. Heart failure with preserved ejection fractions got data coming out regularly.
Hmm.
There's kind of mixed bag on that. Some studies show a benefit, some newer ones have not shown it. So I think there's more clinical conditions where, if you think about like beetroot juice just as like beetroot juice, then it's like,
Hmm.
this sounds kind of crazy. But if you think like nitric oxide, and we know
Hmm.
that like a ton of diseases reduce nitric oxide, and we know it's really good for you,
Hmm.
well, this will directly increase it. So I think there's probably a lot of unexplored conditions clinically
Yeah.
that could be poked at with it too. But
Yeah. Very
um,
interesting. But okay, one last question before we reveal your truths and lies.
mm.
What is the difference between, like, I've seen some products where on the label it doesn't say beet juice, it says betaines or betaines, B-E-T-A.
Oh, betaine. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think it's an entirely different like compound, I think. So I haven't actually looked into it much, but I remember maybe halfway through my PhD, I kind of discovered this, and I wanted to see what role of that, was explaining some of the differences and stuff. But I can only say that whatever role that played in our studies,
Mm,
um, it would have been the exact same in both arms, because the
yeah.
placebo group again was still getting the same nitrate or the same beetroot juice, which would have
Hmm.
still had the same. I don't know. I've heard it's pronounced betaine or betaine. I don't know,
Oh,
but it would
yeah.
have still had the same amount of that. It's just
Yeah.
wouldn't have had the same nitrate. And we didn't
Yeah.
test it, so I can't confirm it. But I
Right.
would speculate, because
Yeah.
the whole point of the placebo from that company is that it's the exact same product without the nitrate.
Yeah. Well, we
So
will
sorry,
link
I don't
that.
have those answers.
No, no worries. We'll link that beet product for our male listeners or our postmenopausal females maybe in the show notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump back to your two truths and a lie because we're jumping on time here. But you said you were
Gotcha.
the first person in your family to attend college, that you played
Mhm.
college soccer, and that you spoke your college graduation. I was thinking the college graduation was a lie. What
Mhm.
was the lie?
No, it's actually, I did not play college soccer. I played
Oh,
high school soccer,
okay.
and I broke my toe like three times, and I
Oh,
probably could have went like D3, but I'm not that
oh
good. But
man.
I,
Yeah.
I was the first person in my family to attend college, which I almost gave away
Amazing.
because I talked about my dad being a mechanic.
Yes, I caught
Mechanics
that.
don't tend to go to college. And I did speak at my college graduation, which was crazy because I had no
Yeah.
business doing that. But um, yeah, there's like 1,000 people in the crowd. I blacked out. I don't even remember what I
Oh,
said.
yep.
I was
Yeah.
so nervous. But
Yep.
yeah,
That's
those are the
great.
truths. I did not play
Amazing.
college soccer,
Okay. But
but
you
I'm
did
I'm
play soccer.
honored that you
So
thought I did.
yeah, I did. I remember reading it somewhere in your bio that you played soccer, but I couldn't
Yeah.
replace if it was college or not. Congrats on being the first to attend college in your family. I am the same.
I
The
appreciate it.
first. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so fun. Where can people find you, follow your research, all that stuff?
Yeah, so PubMed's always a good source, right? Or Google Scholar, you can always look up
Hmm.
my name, Austin Hogwood, or I'm also on Twitter or X, which I guess people are like jumping ship, and they have been for a while, but I'm stubborn. But I'm on there. I think my handle is at Hogwood_AC, so it's like the same name that would pop up for me on PubMed.
Perfect.
Those are the main places where I post things. I think I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't use it much.
Yeah.
But
Awesome.
yeah, and people can always reach out to me via email. My email is very easy to find online. I'm always happy to talk about research. And but like I've kind of disclosed, I'm in a whole different area right now. I'm
Yeah.
doing cardiology research, studying inflammation,
Hmm.
with clinical trials and heart failure and stuff. So I'm really not doing any of the nitrate stuff at the moment. I want
Yeah.
to come back to some of it in the future. But I think if people want to ever chat about it, I'm happy to chat. And I love mentoring people and helping guide people in their careers and
Amazing.
their career paths. So if anyone ever is like, hey, I heard the podcast and, I wanted to know how you decided X, Y, or Z. I'm more than happy to offer that insight.
That's amazing. Definitely appreciate that. I think we need more of that in the science world too. So
Yeah.
amazing. Well, thank you again so much. This has been so informative.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you having me.
That you met.